So this is another one of these kind of global research reports that provides guidance on what an automated asset and interest disclosure system could look like, and what kind of risk analysis one can perform. So it gets into some of these issues around fully maximizing the use of a digital system, potential red flags that one could look into that could be applied to the South African system.
And then 311 is where you start, where the documents start addressing South Africa specifically. 311 is financial disclosure form and e-disclosure system of South Africa. And that's the document, in fact, that we've spoken to already, but just again briefly to summarize what it addresses.
So this document serves a dual purpose. It both looks at South Africa's current form and evaluates some of its potential gaps and areas that it can be improved. And then it looks at the e-disclosure system as well, and provides some recommendations on how data should be captured, on how you could fully automate some of the verification functions, how you could introduce the kind of automated risk assessment of declarants profiles.
Page 344, how to put in place effective sanctioning provisions for financial disclosure-related violations. Note for South Africa.
So this one was prepared specifically for the South African context to identify potential options for introducing sanctions mechanisms. So a lot of the issues that we've just discussed, but it also provides a list of international examples, drawing on their laws to give examples of what this can look like within a legal framework.
Then on 364, a short document entitled Reform of the Financial Disclosure System in South Africa.
So this is effectively, this was the first document that we had written looking at the whole framework comprehensively. So it's very short. It provides effectively just a summary of how the current system works and some of the initial shortcomings. So it's at quite a high level, and the documents that we've just mentioned, I think, gets into a lot more of the technical detail on areas for improving. But this one, it's a bit more at the institutional level, how the framework could potentially address some of the fragmentation.
And then at page 369, there's a document that we haven't touched on yet, which is called Preventing and Managing Conflicts of Interest in the Public Sector. It's a G20 document, as I understand. It was prepared for the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group. Can you briefly, and again briefly because this is another book,
sure.
Describe what's being addressed here?
Yeah, so this document is something that was prepared in collaboration between the World Bank, OECD, and UNODC. So it provides a lot of good practice guidelines on some of the issues we've discussed today that extend a little bit beyond financial disclosure. So looking at how you can go about preventing conflicts of interest, policies around receiving gifts, incompatibilities, and by incompatibilities I mean, for example, limitations on officials being allowed to run companies on the side, conducting other remunerative work. There are other aspects around kind of pre- and post-employment that you might want to think about in terms of the kind of conflicts of interest that can raise, or misconduct. And so it's I think a good guide in terms of some of the issues that one might want to consider within the broader corruption prevention framework, integrity management, that goes beyond financial disclosure in a narrow sense.
I mean, one of the issues that we haven't talked about is that as things stand, the disclosure form itself seems not to address, not tied to any sanctions relating to performing substantial work or deriving substantial income from outside your official employment? And are there, first of all, are there rules that you're aware of in South Africa that govern that? And second, what are international best practices in relation to senior public service managers and outside work or outside remuneration?
Sure. So there's a few issues here, and maybe let me start with the question of conflicts of interest. So one of the ways that the disclosure form is used currently is to identify potential conflicts, and that then being primarily whether an individual owns a company, or is the director of a company. And in the current system, the main way for verifying that there is no conflict is to determine whether that company is on the central suppliers database. So these are companies that that get government procurements, that tender for procurements. And this is one of those instances where there is existing rules around incompatibilities. So I believe it's the Public Administration Management Act that introduces this restriction, which effectively says that public servants, the public sector, is not allowed to do business with the state. So this is one of the checks that's currently being performed to determine whether there are any conflicts of interest. Coming to the question of SAPs, in the parliamentary questions, there is this response where the acting Minister of Police mentions, I believe every year it was around roughly 30 changes, potential conflicts of interest that were reported by the Public Service Commission among the senior management service. And effectively, in most of these cases, what it would be is that somebody owns a company. The Public Service Commission checks that against the central suppliers database. It determines that they're not getting government contracts. They say that's fine. They then report that to the executive authority, that being the minister. So in terms of both the public service regulations and the SAPS's employment regulations, they're both very similar, that when it comes to potential conflict of interest, the authority rests with the minister to determine whether this is a genuine conflict. So we need to, when we talk about conflicts of interest, we need to recognize that there's a difference between potential conflicts that could become actual conflicts. And I use the example of, doing business with the state. That is an actual conflict. Owning a company is a potential conflict that might, at a later stage, put you into a place where you find yourself having a very direct conflict between your official duties and your own private interests. And in cases where this kind of potential conflict arises, in terms of the relevant regulations, the executive authority is supposed to appoint a panel of at least 2 persons to consider the interest and provide independent recommendations on what should be done. The regulations are a bit thin in terms of what the potential solutions are. So it leaves it open to interpretation to the individual line ministries to determine how to deal with those conflicts and how to manage them. What you'll find in a lot of other jurisdictions is that they will set out the different kinds of measures so that there's a lot more consistency to say, under these conditions, the individuals should divest from their interests, or they should give up their position in the public service, or potentially, move to another department where the conflict doesn't arise. So I think you need to be a bit more specific around how to manage these conflicts. But again, the same issues that we have with having these verifications, having the lifestyle reviews decentralized, the same issues apply to conflict of interest management. It is discretionary. There is little oversight in terms of how this is handled down the line. But then speaking to the question on international practice and what this looks like in many other places, is that you would have much higher standards in terms of prohibitions on civil servants engaging in business, not just with the state, but in business more generally. So if I can use Poland as an example, in terms of their regulations, a public sector employee is not allowed to hold more than 10% of interest or shares in a company. And so that helps diminish some of those potential conflicts of interest. In other cases like Japan, they have restrictions which mean that as a public sector employee, you're not allowed to be on the board of a company, you're not allowed to be the director of your own company. And so it creates much kind of higher standards for what kind of outside interests you're allowed to have in the first instance. And there are a few reasons why you'd want to do that. It is about maintaining perceptions around impartiality, around public sector integrity. But it's also a question of how these outside interests can, I think, A, distract you from your core business. If you're doing other remunerative work or you have a company on the side, where is your focus? What does your day look like? How much time are you spending on these outside interests? But B, also, what are the risks related to having these additional interests? Are they being used to funnel bribes and turn them into seemingly legitimate income? And I think that is one of the major risks around having these kind of these rules where you allow individuals to have outside business interests beyond their public sector role.
Thank you very much. We've reached, we have to end very quickly, and because we have another witness coming after lunch, but your conclusions are really tied together from pages 29 to 33. And I mean, the conclusions speak for themselves, so I'm not going to ask you to read those pages, but is there anything in there, if you had one last word, what would your last word be to this commission? It can be more than one word.
It's a big question. I think a lot of the recommendations we've already discussed in pointing out some of the weaknesses of the current approach. I think the main message I want to drive home is that a lot of the fragmentation and weaknesses that we see in the current framework are a result of incremental attempts to improve the system. If we use the example of the SIU trying to fill in this gap to conduct lifestyle audits through secondment arrangements, this is an interim measure. I think the use of the Public Service Commission as a verifying agency is also one of these examples of a somewhat interim measure. And so I think the system in its current form has reached the limit of incremental improvements and has reached a point where you need the more substantive overhaul of how these functions are dispersed, of what the mandate looks like, what kind of powers are needed. And this is, I think, where it feels to me that the only conclusion, looking at the deficiencies and gaps in the current system, the only conclusion is a substantive overhaul that involves some kind of a dedicated corruption prevention agency. Whether that is the model proposed by NACAC that builds on the SIU is open to debate. I think people can have views on what the optimal model is. I think they have some great suggestions, but I think that there's more detail around the particular functions that still needs to be refined to understand how to overhaul the system so that you have a more cohesive institutional framework. And so that's, I think, the kind of closing point that I'd want to drive home, that incremental improvements is just not going to be enough. This is really a major overhaul that's needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask the question? It may well be it's in one of the reports. We haven't had the benefit of looking at these reports. Has the work that you've done for South Africa in particular gone so far as to identify, for example, where you say these kind of, given the current regime, you would need these kind of legislative changes? I'll give you an example. One of the weaknesses that you identify is in this fragmented arrangement that pertains now is disciplinary action. An investigation is done, a review is done, a problem is picked up, and then it still must go to the head of department or human resources to make a decision whether to discipline or not, and often that's where things die. You know, they end that. We've seen some cases like that here in a different context. And yet, there are appropriate cases where that is prescribed by law as matters stand. And so my question is, from that context, that have you gone so far as to identify what changes would need to, legislative changes in particular, would need to be in place to address some of the problems that you have diagnosed? Have you gone that far?
So in many of the cases, the documents that I've mentioned that are written particular to the South African context, it's both a diagnosis of the challenges. It introduces the international examples of how such measures are implemented in other countries, and will usually end with recommendations for what can be done. A lot of that it's particular to, for example, like you mentioned, the sanctions issues, but we've also worked on our suggestions for what we believe a dedicated corruption prevention agency could look like. And it builds on NACAC's recommendations to add on some additional functions in terms of financial disclosure, conflict of interest management, etc. And that is something that can be shared with the Commission if that's something that you would like. If there are other areas that we haven't covered, we'd of course be welcome to, or happy to provide additional details on some of the areas that I maybe didn't speak to today.
Thank you.
Just picking up on that question, very specifically, if you are going to share that material with the Commission, it would be very useful to ensure that all documents essentially flag legislative changes that would be needed, or existing legislative provisions that would have to be made subject to whatever is being recommended, so that we have a more detailed sense of what the existing legislative architecture is that would be affected by changes in this regard.
Mr. Skousen, 367, this reform document, does it not address Commissioner Baloy's question to some extent? Not. So it starts on 364, but the recommendations on 367 have the legislative changes that need to be effected. So, for example, item 2 talks about considering adopting a standalone act that will replace piecemeal regulation and encompass essential elements of the new disclosure system, and then it sets out.
I mean, it does in certain respects, but I mean, if one takes the specific question raised by Commissioner Baloy, I doubt you could ever have a standalone act that would deal with internal departmental disciplinary matters without engaging with the existing legislative framework quite carefully. And it may be that the standalone act won't focus on departmental discipline, it will focus on criminal liability, asset forfeiture. But if it is going to engage departmental liability, labor matters and disciplinary matters, there is a world of other regulatory legislation and indeed parliamentary legislation with which it might have to engage, which we don't necessarily have at our fingertips, and I suspect Dr. Skuman would be more familiar with. There will be another, I mean, we're hoping to have a witness from the Public Service Commission to come as well, and also in part to respond to Dr. Skuman. And that witness, of course, would probably have that legislation at his or her fingertips. We will make sure to raise it in advance. But I mean, the more guidance we get in relation to these sorts of issues, the better, I think.